The king of movie tie-in games, Traveler's Tales, has taken its shot many times at the DC universe, and recently expanded into the multiverse for more characters with LEGO DC supervillains. This company seems enthralled with including as many characters in their games as humanly possible. But what if they could return to something more simple again? With the release of The Batman this year, we are in for a trip through an entire new trilogy, possibly spanning an entire decade. So what if TT Games took this chance to reboot one of their most beloved and popular series of all time, LEGO Batman? I won't lie, this dream game is heavily influenced by my favorite LEGO game, LEGO Batman the video game, the first one released in 2008. Now when I say influenced, I more so mean the conceptual idea of it and many design aspects. While I absolutely love the aesthetic of LEGO Batman 1 taking heavy inspiration from Tim Burton and Joel Schumacher's films, a new LEGO Batman game would need a new set of inspirations. So what made the first LEGO Batman so nostalgic and special in the first place? Aside from it being one of the first games I really played, I just love the idea of it. It's not directly connected to any of these films and doesn't even tell the same stories, but the influence from many mediums combine into this wacky, crazy, colorful, yet gothic world. Throughout my childhood, I heard the magnificent soundtrack of this simple game and didn't fully understand that it came from the first big Batman film released in 1989. I love the idea that this world is very dark, gothic, and disgusting, yet the characters and their attitudes are comedic and lighthearted at many times. It takes events that would be otherwise horrific in real life and creates the exact opposite tone. Another aspect that made the game so captivating to me was its limited nature. I mean, for many people, the villain story was basically an Easter egg they never found. Not only stuff like that, but the lack of an open world. Somehow they made Gotham feel cohesive. They gave us an idea of what this city offered through so many different vistas and unique, colorful locations, yet much of it was hidden away in our curiosity. We can't see every part of the city, but the map definitely gives us room to wonder. I love LEGO Batman 2. It was a huge game as a kid, an entire city to explore with hundreds of collectibles and characters. Unfortunately, while I still love levels like Theatrical Pursuits, Arkham Asylum Antics, and Tower Defiance, over the years I have developed many criticisms of the game. To me, in my personal opinion, many of the levels feel sort of lazy, mundane, and not as interesting as the locations presented in the first game. I'm not a big fan of, generic futuristic design, and that was basically all of Lex Luthor's levels. The end of the game reeked of the Joker robot just constantly showing up. The last 5 levels are just about this stupid robot. The locations didn't have a history to them in the same way that LEGO Batman 1 did. LEGO Batman 2 is trying to juggle the entire Justice League, and to me it just feels a little bit rushed. The first game was so focused on Batman and Robin and their villains, and that was it. Now we are focusing on a wider universe, and it just feels all over the place to me. This is my same problem with LEGO DC supervillains. Gotham and Metropolis are awesome, but then we have stuff like Gorilla City where the aesthetic is entirely different. My favorite part of LEGO Batman 3 is the Lantern Planets because it felt so cohesive and focused on what those planets represented. It had a central theme and connector. They also just looked really nice. Unfortunately, many parts of the game are in completely different locations like miniature Gotham in Europe, the Watchtower, and Brainiac's ship. Now, I'm not arguing against variation, but if there's too much of it, it just feels so rushed and decoherent. It's like with each coming game, they need to stick the most crap from the DC universe they possibly can, rather than focusing on more specific locations and characters. Instead of releasing individual games about specific things like a Green Lantern game or something like that, they have to all pack it into this one game and pack all of these very interesting aspects all into this very limited amount of levels, and it comes out to be something that feels sort of rushed in my opinion. I still love the open world of LEGO Batman 2, but it feels like it's lost its mystery for me, and I find myself going back to the first game for its detailed look at each location. So basically, this was a long-winded way of saying that I want my dream Batman game to be inspired and referenced from the Batman universe, directed by Matt Reeves. In the same way that LEGO Batman 1 wasn't actually canon in any universe, this game wouldn't be either, leaving room for originality. The Batman is probably the darkest film yet for The Dark Knight, arguably, and so I feel like it's perfect for LEGO. Like I mentioned before, LEGO games are always about making dark, serious things comedic at times. Of course, I wouldn't want this game to be completely devoid of seriousness. Gotham would be equally as noir, dark, and gritty as the film. You could even use its soundtrack, as I feel like that could perfectly work as ambient tracks for exploring levels, in the same way that 1989 track did for LEGO Batman. Batman 1989 and Batman Returns was at one time the darkest version of Batman, and so TT Games took that horrific Gotham City and combined it with some of the wacky elements of the Schumacher films that better match LEGO than live action. The rest was filled in with the comics. I especially feel like the wackiness of this new LEGO game could be elevated if there was no voice acting and only mumbling. It might be unrealistic for that to be a forced option today, but given the new Star Wars, it would definitely be an option. So I want this game to be hyper-focused on this new interpretation of Gotham City and its growing rogues gallery. Obviously, we've only seen a few villains in this new universe, but I think the game could focus on a smaller number of villains than LEGO Batman 1 did, which will be possible for a design purpose I will talk about later. TT Games could easily talk to Matt Reeves and ask how certain villains would be interpreted in his world, and there you go. And even then, this isn't canon, so the influence doesn't have to be perfect or predict the future. In fact, it could focus on villains that probably won't appear in the new Batman sequels. Obviously, a good question to ask would be who would be the second playable character. Since this isn't canon, there could easily be a Robin that matches this world, or probably Catwoman could be Batman's sidekick, or both at certain points in the story. Maybe Jim Gordon could be playable for a mission. I think limiting the pick to a few characters is simple and focused. Ultimately, what I want this aesthetic to achieve is immersion through consistency and smart details. Obviously, it will still be gamey, you'll still have those classic LEGO sounds we love, but I want that stuff to be stacked on top of a layer of realism. I want that contrast to be a defining element of the game that is immersive and balanced just right. I don't just want the LEGO formula to be imported, I want it to be unique and fitting to this specific vision of Gotham. This lower number of hero characters also helps with this aspect of the game. I want the combat to be more interesting than previous titles, but I also understand that the age range for this would be very wide. Kids need something simple, which is what LEGO games represent many times, and capturing the child and adult audience is very important to me. When you first start the game, the combat would be exactly like other LEGO games, simple with only two inputs possible, hit and grab. But then there would be an upgrade system that wouldn't be obnoxious or necessary for those who want a more complex game. This upgrade tree that you buy with studs would consist of new fighting moves and button combinations in combat. These can mostly be cosmetic, but some could also be takedowns like the grab that will one-shot an enemy. I also think raising the default amount of hits it takes to take down enemies from 1 to 2 to 2 to 3 would also incentivize this system, but wouldn't make the game much harder for those lower skilled players, as you can't really die in a LEGO game. This also gives me an idea. What if there was an optional mode where you have limited lives? Sometimes a limited amount of moves used to beat up goons makes the fights more boring, and I think limiting the playable characters could help bring randomness and variety to the combat because they could focus on a ton of different animations for these specific characters. I think the combat here needs to be more dramatic yet still campy. Furthermore, the Batcave would exist as the intermediate area. Here you would be able to customize your different suits with studs, look at character biographies, and see your collectibles. I think having the cave be the abandoned subway from the Batman would give it a lot of originality, since we've seen at least 3 different Batcaves so far under Wayne Manor in LEGO games. So this aspect I think is going to be what makes this game stand out, in my opinion. This might be a controversial take for a modern LEGO game, but I do not think my dream LEGO Batman game would have an open world for 2 reasons. 1, realistically, I would like the developers to focus on the actual levels rather than a large open world that will inevitably be disappointingly barren beyond redundant collectibles. 2, I think limiting the world to the levels themselves creates a sense of wonder and mystery that will never be achieved by an open world realistically. In short, I want these levels to be as detailed and polished as possible for maximum replay value, something I struggle with many times in LEGO games. So this is a few weeks after I wrote this video and recorded it, and I think I need to sort of clarify this statement because I don't think an open world, like, it sounds like I'm saying open world is impossible to do, and I don't think I love open worlds. It's just that I think I'm putting this wrong. I think this should start out without an open world, especially if there's going to be like a second game in this. That should be the one that should have the open world, but Lego Batman 2 fell into so many open world traps where a lot of the world was really bland and like graphics were really bad and under detailed, and I don't want another open world to fall into that trap. I don't want the open world just to be there just to say we have an open world. I want it to actually add to the game, have substance to it, not just be a requirement because open worlds are like the big trend in video games for like the last decade. That's not what I want it to be, and that's what I'm trying to say here. So I'm not entirely against an open world, but realistically, I know this is a dream game, but I'm sort of thinking about, like, what if a developer saw this video? What's most important to me for this game is the actual level design and the mechanics I'm talking about and the narrative I'm talking about and the aesthetic I'm talking about. Realistically, if they spend all this time making an open world just to have an open world, just to have collectibles, that's going to take away time that could be spent on these other aspects that I think need to be focused on more in Lego games and not just the open world, because the open world can be cool. It just needs a lot of time and effort put into it. Now, what would these individual levels be like? Well, if this new game is going to stand out as a landmark Lego title, it needs to do something different, yet doesn't destroy the fundamentals at the same time. If we're thinking more realistically, this dream game would have fewer levels than something like Lego Batman 1 for a good reason, probably half the levels, but each level would have far greater size and detail than normal, featuring non-linear paths. Imagine a level on the streets of Gotham. You're going down the main objective path, but then you discover an alleyway that you can actually enter. And from there is an almost smaller level within a bigger level where collectibles could be and bits of story info I will mention later. Ultimately, going down this path will show you unique locations and will then conjoin back into the main level at some point. I think the player should be offered more agency in how they decide to tackle key situations rather than there being one solution every time. I think for the younger audience, there could be that simple solution that might take longer to do and be a little bit less rewarding, but still rewarding nonetheless. This sort of design enforces replayability, and I think it gives a lot more agency to the player, and I think players would really like that in a Lego game. Especially if you can't always explore every single path in the same playthrough of each level, you will have to experience it, you will have to replay it, and I think that adds a lot of replay value. It offers a sense of exploration that no other Lego Batman game offered to this degree, at least in the level. There would always be something you haven't found and will go back searching for, not just collectibles either. This dynamic, non-linear design is why the amount of levels need to be lower, and I think this would absolutely interest the older audience of these games, as it's much harder to replay the same thing again as an adult. It presents complexity that has been missing from their experience since they were kids. I also think many kids may play through the obvious path and then realize there was much more to explore. Kids love Easter eggs and secrets, and it would give them many reasons to go back and play it again. The storyline of this Lego Batman is quite important because the story of the Batman is pretty mature. When you look back at Lego Batman 1, the villain motivations were purposely campy, vague, comedic, and cliche. The story wasn't really a key factor in the game, it was just to set up each location. I think this new game needs to focus way more on the story than that, and many Lego games since have had more and more complex storylines, so I think it fits. Here, the balance between the mature themes of the Batman and the lightheartedness of the Lego games needs to be just right. The story cannot be too prevalent, as the gameplay is the key selling point of a Lego title. So this game should use serious characters that have serious motivations, but through the vagueness of the story, the mature themes aren't extremely obvious, especially for kids. For instance, the Riddler could be planning to destroy City Hall, but the way he plans to do it isn't as serious and dark as his live-action counterpart. Riddler's motivation would be obscured in Easter eggs and a new story mechanic I have come up with as well. By the way, this doesn't happen in the film, it's not a spoiler, it's just hypothetical. This has been done many times in LEGO games. I mean, you basically decapitate every goon in the game and then they disappear out of existence. I mean, you can't even bury these guys. These otherwise dark and horrific things are presented in a way that makes them somehow innocent and fun. The balance is very important though, I can't stress that enough. I don't want this game to be too lighthearted that it voids the aesthetic and atmosphere of the rest of the game, or mock the themes of the live-action rendition. So this new narrative mechanic that I mentioned a few moments ago would be a large detective board in the Batcave that, if you explore enough, can be filled up and a grand mystery solved at the end of the game. The evidence you would find throughout the game would change the ending of the game once each bad guy is caught. If the story is taking inspiration from the Batman, it needs to be a detective story. So where would this evidence be found? Well, aside from a few obvious ones to introduce the idea, most would be found off the beaten path in those side levels I mentioned earlier. For example, you find a diner where Edward Nashton was at some point. He accidentally left a clue to where he lives, and you can follow the breadcrumbs to his apartment somewhere in that level. Inside would be collectibles, but also a key piece of evidence you could use to tie him or one of his victims within a larger crime syndicate. I just really like stuff like this, and I think LEGO games need more stuff like this. I enjoy learning about the cityscape I am playing in and the characters I am up against. It sparks curiosity and it elevates the immersion. It makes the world feel more real. And I know that's kind of weird for a LEGO game, but I think that's what the seriousness of this reference sort of involves for this game. In addition to the hero's arc, I would love there to be a villain side of the story as well, in the same vein as LEGO Batman 1. I really enjoyed seeing how the hero and villain story connected to each other in the game, and how the levels can join together sometimes. In this game, the villains would need their own narrative mechanic that incentivizes exploring as well, and their lair would have its own sort of board tracking that progress. Obviously, it would have to be a little bit different. I don't think Arkham Asylum would fit as their lair in this more grounded reality, but maybe something like the Iceberg Lounge from the film. I mean, that location has so many different areas. It's got the main club, the underground club, and Falcone's penthouse. And I think that's the same thing for the Batcave, where you could actually ride the elevator up to the penthouse of Wayne Tower. As for the character selection on the villain side, I think the villains could be more experimental with more characters than the hero side, in a similar sense to LEGO Batman 1, and they could be a little bit less detailed since there's more of them, obviously. So all in all, you can see that a key aspect of this game is exploration and replayability. Exploration, the visuals of each level, is my favorite aspect of LEGO Batman, but I've struggled many times with replaying levels because the collectibles just aren't enough many times. I need some type of narrative substance to why I'm going out of my way to replay something. I think many teenagers or adult fans of LEGO would agree with this. And I really don't think people would mind a sort of different type of LEGO game that could experiment more with this type of non-linear design to sort of shake up the LEGO formula that we're so used to. What this new game represents to me is a recreation of the experiences I had with Batman as a kid, a character that deeply defined me. The newest Batman film establishes the new Batman of the young generation. If this LEGO game existed, this would be their LEGO Batman game of their generation. It will inspire them like me and many others to dive into the world of Gotham, filled with stories and lessons I believe are important for the youth to understand. Batman in all forms will continue to touch the hearts of every generation. It presents yet another outlet for something I find very, very important: childlike wonder.